Elderly Millionaire was kicked out of a luxury dealership because of his clothes. Minutes later, when he returned, everyone was shocked by what he did. Edward Miller was a man who defied expectations. At 78 years of age, he had accumulated an impressive fortune over his lifetime, but few knew about it. To those who knew him only superficially, he was just another ordinary elderly man, always wearing the same shirts worn out by time, simple fabric pants, and shoes that had long lost their shine. Edward didn't care about appearances. He believed that a person's true value lay in their actions, not in their possessions. Living in a modest house in the suburbs, Edward maintained an almost monastic routine. His days began early with a walk around the neighborhood, where he greeted old friends and acquaintances with a serene smile. He spent most of his time on simple activities, tending to the garden, reading his favorite books, and visiting his daughter Alice and his grandson Arthur. Alice had faced many challenges in life, including a complicated divorce. To Edward, money had never been a source of happiness. He used it sparingly, maintaining a lifestyle that could be considered austere by many. His best-kept secret was that many years ago he had won a huge sum in the lottery. But instead of flaunting his wealth, Edward decided that he would live simply, investing most of his money and saving it for times of real need. And that moment came during one of the visits to the hospital where Arthur was admitted. The boy, with his 7 years, always showed a special sparkle in his eyes when talking about cars. In one of those conversations, he revealed to his grandfather his biggest dream: to ride in a Ferrari. Arthur had a passion for exotic cars, which for him represented speed, adventure, and above all, freedom. Seeing his grandson's life still so full of dreams and aspirations, Edward made a decision that would change everything. He was going to buy a Ferrari for Arthur. Nothing mattered more to him than fulfilling his grandson's wish. A simple yet grand desire for a boy like Arthur. It was a Saturday morning when Edward, determined, put on his best shirt, which, although the newest, still showed signs of time, and left the house with a clear purpose. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and the idea of entering a luxury dealership, an environment completely unfamiliar to him, made him feel a little uncomfortable. But nothing mattered more than seeing the smile on Arthur's face. On the way to the dealership, Edward reflected on how money had never been a priority for him. Even so, he was about to use it in the best way he could imagine, bringing joy to his grandson. When he arrived at the dealership, an imposing facade of glass and gleaming steel, Edward took a deep breath and walked through the entrance. Edward Miller entered the dealership with calm but firm steps. The shine of the luxurious cars, displayed under impeccable lights, contrasted with the simplicity of his clothes. He approached one of the vehicles, silently admiring the elegant lines of the Ferrari that gleamed before him. It was as if the car had been waiting for him, a piece of art that Edward knew could transform his grandson's dream into reality. Before he could continue his contemplation, Edward was interrupted by a sharp voice. "May I help you, sir?" said Andrew, the dealership's manager, with a forced smile that couldn't hide his critical assessment of Edward's appearance. Andrew, a man in an impeccable suit and with a shrewd gaze, was used to quickly judging the customers who walked through his shop's door, and to him, Edward seemed anything but a potential buyer. Edward, unfazed by Andrew's cold tone, responded calmly, "Yes, I'm interested in buying a Ferrari." Andrew stifled a laugh. The idea seemed absurd to him. "A Ferrari," he repeated, as if the words were hard to believe. "Are you sure, sir? These cars are, well, let's just say they're a bit more expensive than what you're used to." Edward's response was simple and direct. "I know what I want. My grandson wants to ride in a Ferrari, and I want to buy one for him." For a moment, Andrew was silent, which seemed like an eternity to Edward. The manager looked around as if expecting someone to confirm that it was all just a joke. When he realized that Edward was serious, his expression changed from disbelief to disdain. "Look, sir, I think you should think twice before joking about something like this. Our Ferraris are not for everyone. Maybe you should look elsewhere. Something more appropriate," Andrew said, the sarcasm weighing in every word. Edward, feeling the growing humiliation, tried to argue, "I'm not joking, young man. I have the means to pay for this car, and I'm willing to make the purchase now." But Edward's words fell on deaf ears. Andrew, already impatient and clearly uncomfortable with the elderly man's presence, stepped forward and with a brusque gesture pointed to the exit. "I think I've heard enough. It's best if you leave before I have to call security. I don't want any trouble here." Those words hit Edward like a blow. The elderly man, who rarely let himself be shaken by small things, felt a mixture of shame and sadness. He wasn't used to being treated that way, especially when all he wanted was to fulfill his grandson's wish. Shaken, Edward turned and began walking toward the exit, his hands trembling slightly as he held the old wallet in his pocket. For him, it had been a frustrating encounter that not only derailed his plans, but also his dignity. When he was about to cross the store's glass door, he heard a young and friendly voice call out, "Sir, please wait!" Edward slowly turned and saw a young man approaching. It was Ryan, one of the dealership's salesmen. Unlike Andrew, Ryan had a sincere and welcoming look that immediately brought some relief to Edward's heart. "Sorry for my colleague's attitude," Ryan said with a regretful expression. "He shouldn't have spoken to you that way. Please come back. I would be honored to show you the cars." Edward hesitated. The bitterness of Andrew's words still echoed in his mind, but something in Ryan's voice made him reconsider. There was an honesty and kindness that he hadn't expected to find in that place. "I don't know," Edward began, still undecided. "I understand, sir," Ryan quickly replied. "But if you really want to make your grandson's dream come true, let me help. Let's look at these cars together without rushing. I guarantee the experience will be different." As Ryan spoke, Andrew, who had been watching the scene impatiently, received an urgent call. Something that seemed to be an external problem required his immediate attention. Andrew, still in a bad mood, hurried out of the dealership, leaving Edward and Ryan alone. Edward looked at Ryan and saw in the young man's eyes a genuine desire to help. With a sigh, he nodded. Perhaps there was still hope that Arthur's dream would come true. Ryan smiled broadly, extending his hand to Edward. "Let's go, sir. I'm sure we'll find the perfect Ferrari for your grandson." Edward followed Ryan through the luxurious showroom. The Ferraris, with their vibrant colors and impeccable design, were true works of art. Ryan began explaining the technical details of each model, speaking enthusiastically about the power, speed, and advanced technologies that made those cars so special. While Ryan spoke, Edward listened attentively, but his heart was elsewhere. The brilliance of the cars couldn't erase the constant worry he felt for his grandson. That desire of Arthur's to ride in a Ferrari weighed on him like a responsibility that needed to be fulfilled at all costs. Noticing Edward's distant gaze, Ryan paused. "Mr. Edward, I feel there's something more behind your interest in buying this car. I could be wrong, but it seems like it's not just about acquiring a luxury item." Edward, who had always been a reserved man, felt he could trust Ryan. Maybe it was the tone of his voice or the way he genuinely seemed to care. In any case, Edward decided it was time to share the real reason for his visit to the dealership. With a deep sigh, he began, "Ryan, you're right. I'm not here just to buy a car. I'm here because of my grandson, Arthur." Ryan kept his gaze fixed on Edward, encouraging him to continue. "Arthur is only 7 years old, but he has already been through a lot in life," Edward said, his voice trembling with emotion. "He has always been a boy full of energy, with a special love for cars. To him, Ferrari is the pinnacle of all dreams. He sees these cars as something almost magical, something he has always wanted to experience." Edward paused, struggling to maintain his composure. Ryan noticed the depth of the emotions in every word the elderly man said, but there was something more that Edward hadn't yet revealed. "Recently we found out that Arthur is sick," Edward continued, his voice now softer but laden with sadness. "He was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a degenerative disease that is slowly taking away the things he loves. The doctors say we don't have much time, and all I want is to fulfill his wish before it's too late. I want him to have the chance to ride in a Ferrari, even if it's just once. That's my only goal here." Upon hearing the name of the disease, Ryan felt a knot form in his throat. Multiple sclerosis was something he had heard of, but he had never imagined that a child could suffer from something so devastating. He looked at Edward and saw not just a customer, but a grandfather desperate to do something special for his grandson, to offer him a moment of happiness amid such a harsh reality. "Mr. Edward," Ryan began, but his voice momentarily failed him. He took a deep breath and continued, "I didn't know. I'm so sorry for what you and your family are going through." Edward nodded, grateful for the understanding. "I just want to do something for him, Ryan. He deserves a moment of joy, and I can give that to him." Ryan, now with renewed determination, realized that this was not just any sale. It was an opportunity to be part of something bigger, something that truly mattered. He knew he had to act. "Mr. Edward, I will do everything in my power to help you and Arthur," Ryan said firmly. "I will speak to my mother Abigail, who owns the dealership. She needs to hear your story. I'm sure she will want to help." Edward looked at Ryan with surprise and gratitude. "You would do that for us?" "Yes," Ryan replied with conviction. "This is not just a purchase. It's something that can make a real difference in Arthur's life, and we will make sure he has that chance." Ryan was deeply moved by Edward's story and Arthur's wish. It was evident that this was not just another customer wanting to buy a luxury car. It was a grandfather trying to fulfill the last dream of a grandson who was facing a painful battle against a cruel disease. Ryan knew he needed to act quickly and in the right way. With determination, he stepped away from Edward for a moment, picking up the phone to call his mother Abigail, the dealership owner. Ryan knew that for something like this, it was essential that Abigail be involved. It wasn't just a matter of business, it was something that touched the heart. He dialed the number with slightly trembling hands. As he heard the phone ring, he felt the urgency grow within him. Abigail answered after a few rings. "Ryan, did something happen?" Abigail asked, concerned, because it wasn't common for her son to call during business hours unless it was really important. "Mom, I need you to come to the dealership now. It's urgent," Ryan said, trying to stay calm but unable to hide the tension in his voice. "Ryan, what's going on? Is everything okay there?" Abigail questioned, now more alarmed. "It's nothing with the store, Mom. It's a different situation. There's a man here, Edward Miller, and he wants to buy a Ferrari. But his story, it's something you need to hear in person. Please come as soon as you can. It's about his grandson, Arthur. He's sick, and this purchase is much more than just a car." On the other end of the line, Abigail remained silent for a moment, absorbing Ryan's words. She trusted her son's judgment, and if he said it was serious, she knew she needed to go immediately. "I'm on my way," Abigail said firmly. "Don't let Mr. Edward leave. I'll get there as fast as I can." With the call ended, Ryan felt immediate relief. He knew his mother would have the sensitivity and experience necessary to handle such a delicate situation. Now he needed to ensure that Edward felt comfortable while they waited. Ryan returned to where Edward was sitting, still with a worried expression on his face. The elderly man had placed his hands on his lap and was looking down, lost in thoughts about Arthur. He wanted so much to fulfill that dream, but Andrew's behavior and the complexity of his situation left him insecure. "Mr. Edward, my mother is on her way," Ryan said with an encouraging smile. "She really wants to meet you and hear your story." Edward looked up, surprised at how quickly Ryan had acted. "She's really coming. I don't want to be a bother." "Not at all," Ryan replied, sitting next to Edward. "She cares a lot about what we do here, and I'm sure she'll want to help in the best way possible." Edward nodded, feeling a small comfort in those words. Ryan, noticing that the elderly man needed something to ease the tension, began to talk about the cars in the dealership, trying to distract Edward while they waited. "Mr. Edward, did you know that this Ferrari here is one of the fastest we have? It goes from 0 to 60 mph in less than 3 seconds, Ryan said, pointing to one of the nearby models. "I imagine Arthur would love that." Edward smiled slightly. "He would be fascinated for sure. Arthur has always been passionate about cars. Since he was little, he collected miniatures and knew the names of all the models by heart." Ryan continued chatting with Edward, asking questions about Arthur, trying to get to know the boy better, who, even without having met him, had already touched his heart. Every time Edward spoke of his grandson, his eyes shone with a mix of pride and sadness. It was evident how much he loved the boy and how much he cared about offering him something special. Time seemed to pass faster as the two conversed. Ryan made sure to keep Edward entertained, showing more Ferrari models, talking about the brand's history, and even sharing some funny stories from customers he had served. Edward, in turn, began to feel more at ease, sensing that there was someone there who genuinely cared about him and Arthur. Finally, after about 30 minutes, the dealership doors opened again, and Abigail walked in. She was a woman of strong presence, with an air of authority that matched her elegant posture. Her eyes swept the room until they found Ryan and Edward, who were sitting and chatting. Ryan immediately stood up, going to meet his mother. "Mom, this is Mr. Edward Miller," he said, gesturing towards the elderly man. Abigail approached, extending her hand to Edward with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Edward, it's a pleasure to meet you. Ryan told me about your visit, and I'm here to help with whatever you need." Edward slowly stood up, shaking Abigail's hand with a look of gratitude. "Thank you so much for coming. I didn't know who else to turn to, but your son was very kind to me." "Ryan has always had a big heart," Abigail said, casting a fond glance at her son. "Now please tell me more about Arthur and what we can do to help him." Edward sighed deeply before starting to recount once again Arthur's wish, his passion for cars, and the harsh reality they were facing with the disease. Abigail listened attentively, her eyes reflecting the seriousness of the situation. Abigail listened carefully as Edward repeated Arthur's story, each word laden with emotion and deep love for his grandson. Ryan stood by, watching his mother's expression soften as the narrative progressed. Edward spoke about how Arthur, even at such a young age, had an almost magical fascination with cars, especially Ferraris, which he saw as the pinnacle of automotive perfection. He described the sparkle in the boy's eyes whenever he saw a Ferrari, the way he talked about the cars as if they were living creatures, full of power and beauty. "All he wants," Edward said with a choked voice, "is to have the chance to ride in a Ferrari, even if it's just once, and I would do anything to make that wish come true." Abigail felt a tear roll down her face, quickly wiped away with the tip of her fingers. She was moved by the simplicity and depth of Edward's wish, a desire that transcended any commercial transaction. The situation was not about selling a luxury car, but about providing a moment of joy to a child facing a tough battle. "Mr. Edward," Abigail began, her voice soft but firm, "your story has touched my heart. I can't imagine the pain your family is going through, but I can understand how much this moment would mean to Arthur. That's why I've made a decision." Edward looked at her apprehensively, while Ryan also awaited anxiously to hear what his mother would say. "I want to offer you the Ferrari at no cost," Abigail said with a sincere smile. "Consider this a gift from us to Arthur. He deserves to live this experience, and we want to be part of that special moment." Edward blinked in surprise, a bit confused. For a moment he didn't know how to react. It was more than he had ever expected, a gesture of such great kindness that it left him speechless. Ryan beside him smiled broadly, proud of his mother's decision. "Miss Abigail, I don't know what to say," Edward stammered, trying to process the generous offer. "There's no need to say anything, Mr. Edward," Abigail replied gently. "This is our way of contributing to making Arthur's dream come true. I couldn't charge for something like this, knowing what it means to you and to him." Edward remained silent for a few moments, his eyes welling up, but soon a determined expression took over his face. He knew that Abigail was being incredibly generous, but he also knew that he had the means to pay for the car and wanted to do so. Not out of pride, but because he always believed that people should be fair, even in moments like that. "Ms. Abigail," he began, his voice now firmer, "I deeply appreciate your generosity. This truly means the world to me and to Arthur. But I need to be honest with you. I'm not a poor man. In fact, I'm a millionaire. Many years ago, I won a fortune in the lottery. But I chose to live simply because I've always believed that money doesn't define who we are." Abigail and Ryan exchanged surprised glances. The revelation caught them both off guard. The simple man, dressed modestly, who seemed to have little, in fact, possessed a hidden fortune. But what was most impressive wasn't the money itself, but the fact that Edward had never let wealth change his essence. "I understand what you want to do, and I'm immensely grateful for it," Edward continued. "But I insist on paying for the Ferrari. I have the means, and I want this transaction to be fair. If you allow it, I'd like to pay the fair price for the car. This doesn't change the value of your gesture, but it's important to me." Abigail was momentarily at a loss for words. Edward's honesty and integrity were inspiring. He wasn't just buying a car, he was keeping his dignity and values intact, even in such an emotional situation. "If that's what you wish, Mr. Edward, then we'll accept," Abigail finally said with an understanding smile. "But know that your gesture is equally valuable to us. This won't be just another car sold. It will be a reminder of what truly matters in life." Ryan, still processing everything that had happened in the last few minutes, approached Edward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Edward, you are an admirable man. Arthur is very lucky to have a grandfather like you." Edward just nodded, feeling a wave of emotion sweep over him. He knew he had made the right choice by coming to that dealership, and, even more, by insisting on doing things the right way. The sale of the Ferrari was no longer just a purchase, but a symbol of everything he believed in and the love he felt for his grandson. As they finalized the details, Abigail and Ryan made sure everything was perfect. They knew that moment would be unforgettable, not only for Edward and Arthur, but also for themselves. It was a reminder that sometimes business transcends the material and touches the true meaning of humanity. With all the details of the Ferrari sale nearly completed, Abigail and Ryan were focused on the necessary paperwork. Edward watched them in silence, still surprised by the generosity and understanding he had found there. He knew he was about to fulfill a great dream for his grandson, and that gave him a sense of peace and satisfaction. "I'll fetch some documents we need to finalize the sale," Abigail said, getting up and leaving the room to get the papers from her office. "I'll be right back." While Abigail was gone, the dealership door opened again. Andrew, the manager, entered with quick steps, his face carrying an expression of frustration. He had left to deal with an urgent personal matter and was now back, still irritated by the inconvenience he had faced. As he crossed the showroom, Andrew saw Edward out of the corner of his eye, sitting next to Ryan, but he didn't notice Abigail's presence. He frowned upon seeing the elderly man still there, and a wave of irritation washed over him. How was that shabby man still in the store? Without thinking twice, Andrew approached Edward, completely ignoring Ryan, and let out a sarcastic laugh. "You're still here, old man?" Andrew shot with a voice full of disdain. "I thought I'd made it clear that this isn't the place for someone like you. What do you think you're doing? Trying to buy a Ferrari? Don't be ridiculous." Edward, who was sitting calmly, was taken by surprise by Andrew's sudden aggression. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Ryan tried to intervene. However, before he could act, Abigail returned to the room with the documents in hand, overhearing Andrew's last words. Abigail stopped for a moment, her expression changing to a mix of disbelief and anger. She immediately understood what was happening and prepared to act. Andrew, still unaware that Abigail had returned, continued to mock Edward, raising his voice. "This place isn't for people like you," Andrew continued, with an arrogance that only seemed to grow. "You should go look for something more in your league." "Andrew!" Abigail's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. Andrew froze upon hearing his name, instantly recognizing his boss's voice. He slowly turned, realizing with horror that Abigail had been there the whole time. "Miss Abigail, Andrew began, desperately trying to find an excuse, but the words failed him when he saw the icy look on her face. "I heard everything," Abigail said, cutting off any attempt at an explanation, "and I am completely disgusted by your behavior. How dare you speak to a customer like that? How dare you mock someone, especially after everything he shared with us?" Andrew turned pale. He tried to stammer out an explanation, but Abigail wasn't interested in hearing excuses. "This kind of attitude is unacceptable," she continued, each word laden with controlled fury. "I have always valued treating our customers with respect and dignity, regardless of how they dress or appear. You, Andrew, have miserably failed to demonstrate those values." Ryan watched the scene in silence, knowing his mother was about to make a drastic decision. He felt a mix of satisfaction in seeing Andrew held accountable and slight discomfort at the intensity of the situation. Abigail took a step towards Andrew, not breaking eye contact. "Several customers have already complained about you to me, and I've tried to give you chances to improve, but this is the last straw. You're fired, Andrew. Now get out of my store." Andrew was dumbfounded, trying to process what he had just heard. The humiliation and shock were clear on his face, but he knew there was nothing he could say to change Abigail's decision. With his face burning with shame, he turned and left the dealership without even looking back. Silence fell over the room after Andrew's departure. Abigail took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She then turned to Edward, her expression softening once again. "Mr. Edward, I apologize for Andrew's behavior. He acted completely inappropriately, and I hope you know that this doesn't reflect the values that my family and I uphold." Edward, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "I appreciate it, Miss Abigail. You did what you thought was right, and I respect that. But if you'll allow me, I'd like to make a request." Abigail looked at him curiously. "Of course, Mr. Edward. What do you wish?" "I believe in second chances," Edward said in a gentle tone. "Your son Ryan gave me a second chance today by calling me back into the store and listening to my story. I'd like you to consider giving Andrew the same opportunity. Maybe he needs to learn to be kind, but I believe he can change." Ryan looked at Edward with admiration, while Abigail reflected on the request. She knew that Edward was being generous, even after being so mistreated, and this attitude made him even more deserving of respect. "If that's what you wish, I can reconsider," Abigail said after a moment of silence. "But Andrew will have to prove that he is capable of changing." Edward nodded, satisfied with the response. Sometimes all we need is someone to show us the right way. With the tension finally dissipated, Abigail and Ryan returned to the table to complete the sale. Now, with all the papers signed and the situation resolved, they were ready to hand over the Ferrari to Edward, ensuring that Arthur's dream would come true. Shortly after the sale was completed, the atmosphere at the dealership was one of urgency and purpose. Abigail, Ryan, and Edward knew that there was no time to waste. With the contract signed and the Ferrari ready to go, they decided to act immediately. It was still late, and the sun was beginning to dip in the sky, casting a golden light over the city. Edward, with the Ferrari keys in hand, felt the weight of responsibility and emotion. He looked at Abigail and Ryan, who accompanied him to the dealership exit, ready to follow him to the hospital where Arthur was admitted. Everyone knew that moment couldn't wait. The gleaming, imposing Ferrari was parked in front of the dealership as if it had been waiting for this moment. The engine was already running, its low but powerful rumble ready to take Edward to his grandson. "Let's go right now," Edward said, his voice firm but full of emotion. "Arthur deserves this, and we can't waste any more time." Ryan nodded, sensing the urgency in Edward's words. "We'll be right behind you, Mr. Edward," he replied. Abigail and Ryan got into a second car, ready to follow the Ferrari to the hospital. As Edward drove the Ferrari through the city streets, the car cut through the traffic with silent elegance, but its presence did not go unnoticed. The drive to the hospital, though short, seemed like a journey laden with meaning for Edward. He felt his heart racing, eager to see Arthur's reaction to the car. Upon arriving at the hospital, the late afternoon sun painted the sky with warm colors, creating the perfect backdrop for what was about to happen. Edward parked the Ferrari right in front of the main entrance, his heart beating fast with anticipation. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was as always heavy with the gravity of circumstances, but that afternoon, something was about to change. Edward, accompanied by Abigail and Ryan, walked through the hospital corridors with firm steps, each one carrying the expectation of an unforgettable encounter. Upon reaching Arthur's room, they found Alice sitting beside her son's bed, holding his small hand. She looked up when she saw her father enter, followed by Abigail and Ryan. Alice's face lit up with surprise and emotion as she realized that something special was happening. "Dad, what's going on?" Alice asked, standing up to hug him. Edward returned the hug with affection, feeling the weight of his daughter's worries. "Alice, I managed to fulfill Arthur's wish," he said softly, his eyes full of unshed tears. "I brought him a Ferrari. He's going to get the ride he's always dreamed of." Alice brought her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the tears that were already forming. She knew how much that wish meant to Arthur and what it represented for her father. "You did this, Dad? You really brought a Ferrari?" Edward nodded, emotional. "Yes, daughter. It's outside waiting for him." Arthur, who had been lying down, heard the conversation, and even though he was weak, his eyes widened in surprise and joy. "Grandpa, a Ferrari? For real?" he asked, his voice weak but full of expectation. Edward approached the bed and held Arthur's small hand. "Yes, my dear. A real Ferrari just for you. Let's take a ride. What do you say?" With the help of a nurse, Arthur was carefully prepared to leave the room. Alice and Edward helped the boy sit in a wheelchair, while Abigail and Ryan waited outside, ready to see the boy's reaction. When Arthur was taken outside the hospital and saw the red Ferrari parked in front, his expression transformed. The fatigue seemed to have vanished, replaced by pure, childlike excitement. His eyes shone like never before, and a wide smile spread across his face. "Grandpa, it's the most beautiful Ferrari I've ever seen," Arthur exclaimed, his voice full of admiration. Edward, with tears in his eyes, smiled at his grandson. "And it's all yours today, Arthur. Let's take a ride." Carefully, Ryan and Abigail helped Edward place Arthur in the passenger seat of the Ferrari. The boy, despite his weakness, was completely absorbed by the experience. He touched the steering wheel, ran his hands over the dashboard, and closed his eyes for a moment, as if recording every detail in his memory. Edward got into the car, buckled up, and looked at Arthur beside him. "Ready, champ? Let's go." Arthur nodded, still with a smile on his face. Edward started the engine, and the roar of the Ferrari echoed, making Arthur's eyes shine even more. They set off slowly, with Edward driving through the streets while Arthur enjoyed every second. Amazed by the sensation of speed, the sound of the engine, and the sight of cars and landscapes passing by them. The ride was short, but for Arthur it seemed to have lasted an eternity. Every turn, every acceleration was a dream coming true, a moment of pure happiness amid everything that was happening in his life. When they returned to the hospital, Edward parked the Ferrari at the entrance, and Arthur turned to him, his eyes still sparkling with emotion. "Thank you, Grandpa. This was the best day of my life," he said, his voice now soft but full of gratitude. Edward held Arthur's hand and smiled, tears silently streaming down his face. "I would do anything for you, Arthur. Seeing you happy is all that matters." As they helped Arthur back into the hospital, everyone around felt that that moment had been magical. Alice hugged her father tightly, silently thanking him for everything he had done for her son. Abigail and Ryan, watching closely, were also deeply moved. They knew they had been part of something very special, something that transcended any commercial transaction. There, that afternoon, a wish had been fulfilled, and an unforgettable moment had been created. The weeks following Arthur's ride in the Ferrari were marked by a mix of joy and sadness for the Miller family. The sparkle in Arthur's eyes during that brief moment of happiness still resonated in everyone's memory, but the reality of the disease was relentless. And as the doctors had predicted, Arthur passed away shortly afterward. Grief enveloped Edward, Alice, and everyone who had known and loved Arthur. However, even amid the pain, there was a deep sense of peace in knowing that Arthur's wish had been fulfilled. For Edward, that ride wasn't just a farewell. It was a gift that he would always carry in his heart. Abigail and Ryan, equally affected by the experience, felt that that moment had changed something deep within them. Arthur's story and Edward's love had left an indelible mark on their lives. They couldn't let this memory fade. They needed to find a way to keep little Arthur's spirit alive, not just for the Miller family, but for everyone who crossed the dealership's path. It was then that Abigail had an idea that she quickly shared with Ryan. "We need to do more than just remember Arthur," she said one day, while the two were walking through the dealership. "We need his story to inspire others. Let's rename the dealership in his honor." Ryan, touched by the idea, immediately agreed. "That would be wonderful, Mum. Arthur's story can continue to live here and can serve to remind us all of the true value of our actions." Decided, Abigail and Ryan began planning the change. They wanted the dealership's new identity to reflect the values that Arthur had inspired in them: compassion, generosity, and the fulfillment of dreams. Meanwhile, Andrew, who'd been fired after the confrontation with Abigail, underwent a notable personal transformation. The shock of nearly losing everything and Edward's generosity in asking for a second chance for him made him deeply rethink his behavior. He started attending a personal development course, seeking ways to improve his posture and be more empathetic towards others. Andrew sought out Abigail sometime later, not to ask for his job back, but to thank her. "Ms. Abigail," he said, his voice full of humility, "I know I made many mistakes and deserve to be fired, but Mr. Edwards' kindness touched me deeply. I just wanted to thank you for giving me a second chance to become a better person." Abigail, seeing the sincerity in Andrew's eyes, felt that he had indeed changed. "Andrew, I'm glad you took this opportunity. It's rare to find people who recognize their mistakes and strive to change. Keep it up, and maybe one day we can work together again." As the days passed, the dealership's renovation was finally complete. On the day of the grand reveal, Abigail invited Edward, Alice, and several friends and customers to the ceremony. Everyone knew that this wasn't just a commercial event, but a celebration of life and Arthur's legacy. Edward arrived early, accompanied by Alice. Both were visibly moved to see the dealership's new facade, now proudly displaying the name Arthur Miller Dealership. Below the name, in smaller letters, were the words, "Where Dreams Come True." During the ceremony, Abigail gave a brief speech. "Today, we are here not just to inaugurate a new name, but to celebrate the life of a boy who showed us the true meaning of generosity and love. Arthur's memory will continue to live here, inspiring us all to be better and to make the dreams of those around us come true." Deeply moved, Edward stepped up to the stage to say a few words. Arthur was always a lively boy, and his biggest dream was to ride in a Ferrari. Seeing that dream come true was the greatest joy of my life. But what happened afterward, with everyone's support here, showed me that his spirit lives on. This dealership now bears his name, and with that, his memory will be a source of inspiration for everyone who walks through these doors. The plaque was finally unveiled, and everyone present applauded in unison. The words, "Where Dreams Come True," shone in the sun, reflecting the essence of what that place had become. Andrew, who was in the crowd, smiled as he saw the new plaque. He knew that somehow that experience had changed his life forever. He approached Edward after the ceremony, thanking him once again for the chance he had been given, and promised to continue working on himself. From that day on, the Arthur Miller dealership became more than just a place of business. It became a symbol of hope, of the fulfillment of dreams, and of second chances. Everyone who walked in knew they were in a special place where the memory of a boy who loved exotic cars continued to inspire kindness, compassion, and the belief that no matter how difficult things get, there is always room to make dreams come true. And so, the memory of Arthur Miller remained alive, not just in the hearts of his family, but in everyone who heard his story. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.